Hello, and welcome to the Wine Enthusiast podcast, your serving of drinks culture and the people who drive it. I'm Christina Pickard, Wine Enthusiast's writer-at-large covering the wine regions of New Zealand, Australia, England, and New York. We all start somewhere. Even winemakers now at the top of their game began their careers scrubbing barrels for baronesses, babysitting the estate owner's kid, or being barred from the crush pad just for their gender. I recently returned from a trip to New Zealand, where I was lucky enough to rub shoulders with some of the country's top winemakers. In this episode, I coerced three of them: Paul Pujol from Prophet's Rock Winery in Central Otago, Jenny Dobson of Jenny Dobson Wines in Hawke's Bay, and Helen Masters from Adirondacke Winery in the Martinborough region, into sharing intimate tales of their early days in wine, from the hilarious to the downright disturbing. Paul, you are one of New Zealand's most respected winemakers. You're the GM and chief winemaker at Prophet's Rock Winery in Central Otago, crafting some seriously good Pinots and aromatic whites. But I hear you have some colorful tales of your early days in the wine industry. Would you be so kind as to share some of these with our listeners?
Sure. Hi, Christina. I guess quite often you end up talking to people in their established positions, but perhaps missing some of the early days. And to talk a little bit about how I ended up here, I studied in New Zealand, and having completed university, I came up with a fairly foolish idea. I was very keen and came up with this plan to work 5 vintages in 12 months. So it was all about getting experience, and by using the seasonal difference between hemispheres, I figured that I could sort of get ahead of the game by moving around. And so
I'm exhausted just thinking about this prospect.
yeah, it's a very foolish idea. It's a little bit like, how many 90-hour weeks do you want to work in 12 months? But like I said, I was young and keen, and so I had been working at Saracen Estate in Marlborough, initially in the vineyard and then into the winery for harvest. And then my plan was to work in 12 months Saracen. So in Marlborough, the harvest is sort of March, April. And then they had kindly given me the New Zealand winter to go and work the French harvest season. And so I had some contacts in France. And so my plan was to work 3 vintages in the same season in France. So starting in the Languedoc-Roussillon, because they kick off first in August, and then moving up to Sancerre, which is a very compressed harvest, in September, and then moving on to Alsace, who start and finish last, so where the harvest normally starts at least then in October. Then I was going to have a small break and do the vintage in the Hunter Valley, January, February, before coming back to Saracen for the following harvest.
And did you stay on track with these plans?
Almost. So I managed to complete the 3 vintages in France and finished in Alsace, where I was really fortunate to get a vintage position at Kunstbars, one of the top domains in Alsace. And I thought I was just there for vintage, but at the end of harvest, they offered me the head winemaking position. And so that was an opportunity that was far too good to turn down, of course. So a couple of delicate phone calls back to New Zealand, and there I was. I took the job.
And what was it like?
It was, to give you a little bit of context, I was, at this point, just 1 year out of university. So to be offered a head winemaking position was sort of crazy enough. But to be offered a head winemaking position in a domain that was over 200 years old and becoming their first non-family winemaker since 1795 was a big stretch, I think. And not only that, but I hadn't worked or even seen, a number of the 12 grape varieties in Alsace before. So to step into that as your first head winemaking position was definitely a stretch. It would be fair to say that I had a little bit of imposter syndrome. But
Well, let me ask you this, Paul. Were they drunk when they offered you this position?
well, I think, looking back on it now, I can see it a little bit more clearly. In Alsace, if people get into the wine industry and they train and study and do viticulture and enology, it's normally because they're from a winemaking family. And so they're studying to take over a position that, if you like, is already set up for them or is already theirs. And so there really isn't a large pool of winemakers wandering around Alsace looking for a job. And so the domain had been, I think, looking for a winemaker for a while, and in their words, had basically only run into what they referred to as laboratory winemakers, and they wanted someone who was a bit more practical, could actually operate the winery and the vineyards, and knew about both sides. And despite not having been in the industry all that long, I'd studied both and had worked in both at that point. So I guess they saw someone who was a bit more practical and had been, I think, asking me questions and opinions along the way during harvest. And because I thought I was only there for a couple of months, I was quite happy to share my opinions, all care and no responsibility. So I think that's probably how they ended up where they were. And, lovely family. They never told me, how to make the wines or, try to come in and micromanage the winery or the vineyard. So, I was pretty lucky.
And were you thrown in the deep end? Were there I'm sure, some interesting tales to tell in those first few weeks?
Yeah. Once you sort of adjust to the position, like, on the viticulture side, like the two main Grand Cru below the village were planted in the 1920s. So it's a privilege to even walk in those vines, let alone, run the viticulture on them. So that was sort of shock enough. And I guess they sort of saw something in there and had given me the job, but as if I wasn't sort of nervous enough, for want of a better word. I remember a few weeks into the job, not only was I their sort of first non-family winemaker, but they came up and said, well, we've been thinking about it. We're pretty sure you're the first foreign winemaker in Alsace there's ever been. It's like, okay, oh, thanks. thanks for that. So no pressure. And because of, I guess, where the domain and their sort of standing, I ended up very quickly in all these sort of odd and interesting situations where you end up on juries for awarding the appellation. So the appellation jury, blind tastings. So that was really interesting. But also they had a seat on the panel that makes all the laws surrounding late harvest wines, Vendange Tardif and Sélection de Grenoble, the great sweet wines of Alsace, because Kunstbars was pretty famous for dessert wines. And so I remember walking into this room, this panel of 10 people who decide, ripeness levels and all this sort of thing. And, there's Pierre Trimbach and Marcel Dice, Olivier Umbrick, and all these legends, whose wines I'd sort of looked up to, sitting in the room making very serious decisions that will affect the production of these wines across the whole region, So all of them, and then plus the Kiwi guy. So so that was a little intimidating, but amazing, fun, and just such a privilege.
Yeah, I bet.
And I think another early time I felt like I'd been thrown in the deep end was having started in Alsace, was my first sales trip to Denmark, and the story of my first ever wine presentation or wine dinner. And so what happened was I went with the director of Kunstbars to Denmark, basically as a passenger, so that they could introduce me to customers and the importer and so on. And so part of this trip, and I guess the sort of the main feature event was a very formal and very large wine dinner at the Varna Palace in Aarhus, which is sort of a large, very formal wooden spring palace for the royals. And Christian, the director, was going to be presenting the dinner. So there were somewhere between 12 and 15 wines, including back vintages, and Christian was going to be the MC. So fully mic'd up from a lectern, presenting to, it was somewhere between 220 and 250 people in this amazing ornate ballroom.
And this was your first ever wine dinner.
Yeah, so this is my first ever wine dinner, and I was happy just to be a fly on the wall. But what happened was Christian got food poisoning at the last minute. And so suddenly, having arrived at the palace, he was unable to present and had to just go back to the accommodation. And so, with basically no warning, I had to present this wine dinner, for over 200 people in this amazing formal dining room with a lineup of wines that I wasn't as familiar with as I would become later. And as my first ever public wine presentation. And so to say that I was sort of peaking and nervous would be an understatement. And so basically made sure to, inverted commas, check a few bottles of wine for any issues before I started and just jumped in. So over the course of sort of almost 3 hours presenting to this huge ballroom full of people, I basically did the best I could. And bear in mind, I was presenting some of the wines that I was presenting. They weren't older than me, but they were certainly made while I was still at school. And so I didn't feel like I was in a position of having huge banks of knowledge about all of these wines to draw on. And so I survived and, filled in with a few sort of stories about my experience of coming to Alsace and things like that. And at the end of the night, with a huge sigh of relief, I sort of sat back down, and our importer, Knud, got up and wrapped up the evening. And it was all in Danish. And so I didn't really understand what he was saying, but he must have been talking about how I had absolutely no knowledge I was going to be presenting the entire evening, because all of a sudden everyone stood up and started clapping and laughing. And so that was my first ever wine dinner. And after that, the nerves were kind of gone, because every time I get up now to present to a small group or whatever, I just know that nothing will ever be that bad again. And so it kind of got me over the line in one very difficult evening.
What doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right?
Exactly.
I hear you have another story of an interesting, shall we say, dinner, a harvest party dinner in Burgundy that I'm hoping you'll also share.
Sure. So this is a number of years later. So having worked in Alsace for a few years, I then worked a couple of years in Oregon as the winemaker at Lemorson, and returned to New Zealand and started working at Prophet's Rock, where I am now. And a number of years later was invited to work harvest in the winery at Comte Georges de Vogüé in Chambol-Musigny. So, one of the great domains of the world, and I was certainly not in danger of turning that opportunity down. These mythical wines that I certainly wasn't in danger of being able to stock up my cellar with. And so that was the 2009 harvest. And so that was the first time I met Francois Millet, the winemaker at de Vogüé for 35 vintages, who I now have a collaboration with in New Zealand. He comes out and makes a Pinot Noir and a Chardonnay with me every year. And so, anyway, I was tremendously excited to work vintage at de Vogüé. And it's quite a compressed harvest where, because it's just in the commune of Chambolle-Musigny, all of the fruit came in just a touch over 1 week. And so once the picking was done, they have the sort of harvest party where all of the pickers, the cellar team, which is pretty small, myself and two others, the countesses who own de Vogüé, all get together in the lunchroom of the chateau and have this dinner. And so went home, got changed after working in the cellar all day, come back to the winery, and the countesses are there pouring everyone champagne on arrival. And we walk into the lunchroom, which has been set up and catered for the evening with all the pickers and everyone. And there's just one wine for the entire evening. And it's open, all the way down the tables. There's like all these bottles that are all open. And there's spare bottles and crates down the side of the room. And I looked down, and my shock must have registered with one of the countesses, because anyway, it was all 1996 Grand Cru Bon Mar, and one of the great Pinots of the world. And so the countess saw my expression and said, "Well, Monsieur Millet said that this wine's drinking rather well at the moment, and so we've chosen that for tonight." And so I sort of stood there reasonably dumbfounded at this essentially buffet of, all you can drink Grand Cru Bon Mar, and just took stock of my situation. And I remember thinking, well, in physiology, I remember learning that the human body is something like 98% water. This is such an amazing experience. Ideally, when I leave this room, my body will be 98% Grand Cru Bon Mar. And hopefully I can remember the flavour of this wine for the rest of my life. And so we sat down for dinner, and it's all very, very civilized, and the wine is just absolutely spectacular. And working there was just daily trying the best wines I'd ever had in my life, over and over again. And so everyone's very polite and sort of chatting away, and I'm sort of quietly working my way through a few of these amazing glasses of wine. But being France and again being at de Vogüé, it was quite civilized, and so no one's getting drunk or really taking advantage of what's in front of them, perhaps apart from myself. And one of the pickers, so this young girl, Christina, got a little bit tipsy. She got up and gave everyone a song and a sort of big thank you, which was lovely. And so slowly we draw towards the end of the evening, and it's been a lovely meal, and I'm still focused on trying as much of this Bon Mar as I possibly can.
I'm getting to that 98% water wine ratio.
Yeah, exactly. Basically, I guess my view was that, I've trained my entire life for this opportunity. All of those cheap, horrible beers at college, everything has been lining up for this moment. And so people start filing out, and the room is now empty, apart from myself and all of these open bottles of wine, which I see as kind of a bit of a travesty. But I can hear a bit of a commotion outside, and so reluctantly I sort of got up and wandered out, and the picker, Christelle, who'd given us the wee song earlier, she's having a little nap on the ground outside the chateau in the light, drizzling rain. And the two countesses have found her. And so it became clear that the countesses had never seen someone visibly drunk in their lives, because they were quite shocked, and they were discussing what to do and really concerned. They were like, should we call an ambulance? Shall I call my doctor in Dijon to come down? What shall we do? And of course, I remember thinking, well, if you just give me another couple of hours, that may well have been me. And so I felt like I had to intervene. So I wandered up and said, look, I've seen this before. I think she's just a little bit tired. And so I went and found her sister who drove the car around and sort of picked her up and popped her in the passenger seat, put her seatbelt on, popped a bottle of water next to her, and I reassured the countesses that basically she just needed a little nap and she was going to be fine. And then suddenly aware that there was an entire room full of open bottles of Bon Mar that weren't going to be much good in the morning, I tried to sort of wander back in, at which point I was stopped by the countesses who said, Paul, you really need to go home now. And it was at that point I was both disappointed that I'd come out and had not stayed in the room just to have a couple of last glasses, but also disappointed that I wasn't wearing one of those extremely long trench coats with large internal pockets. But feeling that I couldn't really argue, I sort of reluctantly wandered off to sleep in my car. And so it was one of those funny moments that happens along the way where you find yourself sort of in the candy shop, if you like, when it comes to wines.
Absolutely. A kid in a candy shop. I love that story. I have one more story I want to hear from you, which I believe we're going to rewind in time somewhat to your days in the Languedoc. You gave me a bit of a heads up that this was a tale of health and safety. So I'm wondering if you could share this tale with us today, Paul.
Sure. Or rather, it's a tale of life before there was health and safety. And so on that crazy tour where I was trying to work 5 vintages in 12 months, the first stop in France was in the Languedoc-Roussillon. And because they start first in August. And it was a very large, industrial is not the right word, but a large old cellar, not all that far from Narbonne, but inland. It was fairly large. So when you were inside, it kind of looked like Alcatraz, where it was a horseshoe-shaped winery with a large sort of roof over the top, and it was 2 levels of concrete tanks with a sort of walkway on the second floor running all the way along with a hatch every metre, and that's sort of what it made it look like a little bit like a prison. But anyway, this very old cellar had a strain of Brettanomyces or Brett, this spoilage yeast that people try and avoid in the wine industry, that was so tough that it was resistant to just the normal ways that people avoid it, which is basically just sort of hygiene, really. And so they'd figured out that, and they had successfully eradicated it, but they'd figured out the only thing that killed this spoilage yeast was formaldehyde gas. And that's not something that I was aware of, and it certainly wasn't something that we'd studied at university at all. And so before harvest could start, when the winery was completely empty, so there's no wine in there, we, on a Friday, the 4 of us in the cellar started at opposite ends of the winery and on 2 levels at the same time, one person above, one below. And we had to let off these formaldehyde bombs in each of the 126 concrete tanks. So having set them up, what you had to do was sort of pull the pin on these things, and they would then sort of explode, if you like, and just start spewing out this acrid, dark brown, orangey tinged, completely lethal gas. And it was fair to say that I was a little bit nervous. And so starting at opposite ends, you would sort of pull the pin on these things and sort of push the door shut and then repeat and repeat as you sort of moved as quickly as you could towards the stairs at the centre of the winery. And then we all arrived there at the same time, ran down and ran out of the winery, which, of course, had been completely filled with poisonous gas. So that was sort of nerve-wracking enough. And I just remember standing there out in the sun thinking, what the hell is this job that I've started doing? But anyway, we closed up the winery and left it for the weekend. And so as if that wasn't traumatizing enough, I was staying on site in a small house that was, a few hundred yards away. And they asked me to come in early on the Monday morning before everyone came in for work and to open up and air out the winery so that it was safe for everyone to come back in and work there. And I didn't really think too hard about it, or I might have turned them down. And so I turn up to the winery at about 5:30, 6 in the morning on the Monday, alone, with the keys. And I open up the big doors at one end of the winery, and sure enough, it smells like formaldehyde gas. And so left that open for a little bit. But then I had to open up the doors on the other side of the winery, and they could only be opened from the inside. And this is a point that I hadn't really thought about too much when I agreed to do the job. And so what this entailed was basically running through the winery whilst holding my breath, unlocking the door and opening it from the inside. And so it's fair to say I was a little bit nervous and, petrified would have been more accurate. And so I sort of stood there and thought about it for a wee bit and thought, well, we're just going to have to get it done. And so I made sure I had the correct key in my hand for the door, and then took a rather large run up. And as I crossed the threshold of the winery, took a last big, huge breath, and then ran through the winery without breathing to the far end. It's a fairly large winery. And so as your cheeks are turning red and, your eyes are feeling like they're going to explode, we got to the other end, sort of like a horror movie where you've got to open a car in a hurry or something. We're sort of shaking hands, got the key in the lock, was able to sort of lift the crossbar, push the door open, and to sort of collapse outside on the other end. And while I was lying there panting again, I remember thinking, I'm not sure this is exactly what I thought I was signing up for when I started studying in the wine industry. But I guess
I'm glad you emerged unpoisoned.
Yeah, so that's an incredibly dodgy story of the wine industry. Before, I guess there were sort of tight health and safety regulations, but I've never heard or seen of that practice before or since. So that's that short cautionary tale.
Well, that's good. That's good to hear that you've not heard of it since. Oh, well, those are fantastic stories, Paul. I always enjoy hearing any story you have to tell. You're such a fantastic storyteller, and that dry Kiwi humor gets me every time. So I appreciate you sharing with us and hearing a little bit about your early days in wine.
So great to talk to you, Christina. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. And glad you're alive to tell these tales as well.
Yes, thank you so much.
Jenny Dobson, you are a well-known name and personality in the Hawke's Bay region of Aotearoa, New Zealand's North Island. You have been working in the wine industry for over 40 years. You have your own label, Jenny Dobson Wines, which features wonderful illustrations of your family members on the front labels. And you also make wine for a number of other Hawke's Bay brands, including Squawking Magpie and Unison Vineyard. When we met for the first time recently in Hawke's Bay, you started to share some fascinating stories of your early days working in wine. And I told you, stop, tell me all this on the Wine Enthusiast podcast. So here we are. And where would you like to start, Jenny? Welcome, for one.
Well, thank you very much, Christina. It's a pleasure to talk with you. I guess my beginnings in wine started they started a long time ago, but let's start in 1979. And I had finished a university degree in New Zealand in chemistry and decided wasn't a sudden decision. It was one of those decisions that you realize where you need to be. And I decided I wanted to make wine. In those days in New Zealand, there was no wine schools, there was no formal training. And I decided to further my studies by traveling. And I went to France. I was lucky enough to start work with Domaine du Jacques in Maurice-Saint-Denis. And I was blown away. I really felt I had come home. It combined my passion of aromas, of flavors. I never realized I had an artistic side to me. I'd always studied sciences at school. And I found that winemaking is not a recipe. There's an art involved, but it's really useful to have the science. I was young, I was naive, I had a very poor command of French, but none of those things stop you when you're young and enthusiastic. I arrived at Du Jacques. I was picking grapes, but I really, really, really wanted to stay and work in the cellar, which is what I did. And those days in France, there were signs outside cellars that said "Interdit aux femmes," forbidden for women to enter into the winery. I was young and naive. I had a poor command of French. I still went into the cellar. But it was considered a man's domain. In those days it was very physical work, but also one thing that I'd say now, making wine is life. It's not a job. It's life, and maybe 50 years ago, it just wasn't considered a suitable career life for women. There were plenty of women who were owners of properties, but nobody who really chose to make it a career. So they considered also that women had funny acids in their body and were going to turn the wine to vinegar. So I had a few things against me. But I loved everything about wine. It's so different. No 2 days are the same. No 2 vintages are the same. You're stimulated, you're frustrated, you have a sense of satisfaction. It rolls so many things into one. And 50 years on, or 40 years on, 55 years on, 45 years on, I'm still as enthusiastic as I was when I started.
That's amazing. Going back to, when you saw that sign about women don't enter the winery, I think there's a lot of people, perhaps in a younger generation, who would be pretty shocked to hear that. Was that something that you thought when you first saw it, that must be my French. I must not be understanding this sign. Or was it something where you went, oh, I know what this means and I don't care, I'm going in anyway. And then when you did, what was the reaction from the men inside the winery in the cellar?
Well, there was a combination. I was thinking, I don't think I really understand that, but doesn't matter. I'm going in anyhow. And I did work. Jacques Cess is very enlightened. He was running Domaine du Jacques in 1979 when I was there. His sons have taken over now. He was enlightened, but he didn't want to shake the apple tree too much. So we'll wait until the men have gone out to the vines, and then you can come in and do some work. So the first year it happened. The second year I was accepted. I guess the wine hadn't turned to vinegar. So
Do you feel like you maybe changed some ideas or changed some minds with them realizing, oh, hang on, you haven't turned the wine?
I haven't turned the wine to vinegar. The job got done. And I think it was very similar when I went to Bordeaux. There was a lot of skepticism. It's a woman. But the vines were well cared for. The wine was good. In fact, the wine was excellent. And by the time I left Bordeaux, there was almost a sense of, oh, well, we have a woman who makes wine. I think perhaps in Bordeaux, to a certain extent, it helped because I was a foreigner. So I was weird and different anyhow. So the fact that I was a woman on top of being a foreigner just passed. And I was so busy, I didn't have time to worry about whether I was being accepted or even if I was breaking barriers in the early days. I think I did sense it towards the end of my time in Bordeaux that I had probably reached at that stage a bit of a glass ceiling.
And did it start to change after that? Did you start to see, I guess, in the early 80s, more women coming into the cellar, or was it pretty slow? Yeah.
More and more. While I was in Bordeaux, there was a few women creeping into cellars. Lillian Laduis, a foreigner. She was Danish, if I remember correctly. And at Chateau Cassin in the Premier Côte, Mandy Jones, who was an Australian. So, but nowadays, if you look at the intakes into the Bordeaux University wine courses, at least 50% of the people are women, or the candidates are women. To have women winemakers in Bordeaux is completely the norm now. I think 2003, I went back to Bordeaux, and already there was a major change since I'd left in 1995. So it happened quickly. Once it happened, it happened quickly.
Yeah, no, it's a good reminder of how far we've come as well. And even to think about that, New Zealand in the 70s had no training courses for wine. That's how early
Exactly.
days it was. And to think that in France at that time, there was no women allowed in the winery sign. It's pretty, it really puts it into perspective of how far we've come. Certainly still have, still ways to go, but it's really fascinating to hear.
One of the things that I see in New Zealand at the moment, the next generation, let's say just after me, so you've had men and women working side by side in cellars as they start their wine journeys, as they start their careers. So they're working on an equal footing right from the beginning. So when it comes up to those people becoming chief winemakers, CEOs of companies, there won't be the same ingrained bias and prejudice that there was when I started off, when I was the only woman amongst men. So I think the newer generations coming through, women will have, it's never easy. It's never easy in the wine business, but they will probably have a slightly easier path than I had as I came through.
Yeah, I remember I wrote a quote down from you when we were speaking in person that you said to me, I'll never recuperate that pay gap. So
No,
speaking of that, we're talking about women not even being allowed in the cellar, but what about the pay gap? And, that must have been something you've also maybe seen get better, but it's certainly something, as we know, is not on equal footing even now.
well, I was surprised. The New Zealand wine industry did a survey a few years ago, that there is still a pay gap for women working in wine compared to men. I was surprised. I thought we'd got better. Certainly, I'd have to say I took jobs at lower salary than male candidates because I wanted the job. And it's the way I had to work 30 years ago. So if you put 10%, 15, 20% lower pay over a lifetime, that really adds up.
Yeah, it adds up. I know you worked with Stephen Spurrier, who, of course, was the famed British wine merchant and founder of Académie du Vin. He was known for helping put California on the map with the Judgment of Paris tasting in 1976. So I was fascinated to learn that you had worked with him. Could you tell me a little bit about how you got hooked up with him, how you were involved with him, professionally speaking, what that entailed?
Well, I'd say there's two crucial influences on my winemaking. One of them, the first one was Jacques Cess at Domaine du Jacques, where I learnt such great, I started to form my winemaking philosophy of balance, expressing vineyard. It was through Jacques Cess that I got the introduction to Stephen Spurrier. And Stephen Spurrier, again, was one of the great influences on my winemaking, my philosophy about wine, where it fits into our lifestyle, and the great enjoyment and diversity that wine should offer. So I worked with Stephen for almost 2 years, and Stephen was such a buzz to work for Stephen. Wine was so exciting. Wine tended to be, if you were in Burgundy, the supermarkets, the wine stores only had wine from Burgundy, maybe a couple of Alsace, maybe a Bordeaux or two. So in Paris, Stephen had a shop that was packed, jam-packed, full of wines from all over France, from Italy, Spain, Portugal, Australia, didn't have any New Zealand. And I was teaching courses on wine tasting and the wines of France, mainly to English-speaking people. It just gave me the opportunity to learn, to experience, to taste wines from all around the world. And it was so stimulating. It was an absolute buzz. There were sessions. This is where the world is so different now. Monday lunchtime, wine tasting, where there were just people coming in and having lunch and tasting 6 wines. There were courses for sommelier. And so when I wasn't teaching courses, I was preparing for the courses. So I got to taste so many wines. It was such a great education for the palate. And Stephen was an inspiring, fun person to be around and so enthusiastic. And every wine was tasted, and you find the good points about a wine. You know, wine is for enjoyment. Don't find the faults. That's one of a winemaker's worst habits, is they taste a wine and the first thing they say about it is something negative because they're looking for faults. When somebody buys a bottle of wine, they're buying it for enjoyment. So you must find the positives about a wine. I always say to wine students, the first thing that you write on your wine tasting notes is something positive.
I like that.
I think I look back on my life in wine, which is still continuing because I'm getting ready to make another lot of wines and I'm thinking about vintages to come. I'd say that New Zealand is a wonderful place to make wines. I really regret that we don't have any Indigenous grape varieties, but I do love exploring different grape varieties. We are a little bit hampered in New Zealand. We have quarantine regulations, which is very good, but it makes it very difficult to suddenly go, oh, I think that grape variety would work really well here. I'd love to make that wine. But I am making Fiano, which is an Italian grape variety with its home around Naples. And that actually grows extremely well in Hawke's Bay. And I love the wine that it makes. So New Zealand doesn't have as many rules and regulations as France, which offers a great palette, not in an artist's palette sense of making wines of character for people to enjoy. And I think you also have to be very attentive to changing lifestyle, changing consumers. We're looking for fresher wines, but people are still looking for balance. And balance has been the keystone to my winemaking philosophy right back from those days at Dujac in the late 1970s. And I still maintain a wine that is balanced will be enjoyed by many, many, many people.
I love that. I think that's absolutely true. Well, Jenny, thank you so much. I love your spirit and your energy. And I love that after 40 plus years in the industry, you are as excited as you were on day one. I appreciate you sharing those fascinating stories and also reminding us of how far we've come in the industry and also to keep on working. Still glass ceilings to be broken for sure, but really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Christina. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk with you. And as you can see, I could have kept talking for a very long time because I'm so passionate about it.
Oh, I love that you are. Wishing you best of luck with vintage coming up as well.
Thank you very much.
Helen Masters, you are one of New Zealand Aotearoa's most talented and well-respected winemakers. You've been making wine at the acclaimed winery Aotearangi in Martinborough at the bottom of the North Island since 2003. You make a range of beautiful wines, Chardonnay, Riesling, Sauvignon Blanc, Syrah, and of course Pinot Noir, the latter of which are some of the sexiest in New Zealand. But we all have to start somewhere, and I would love to hear how you got your start in wine.
Right. Oh, thanks, Christina. Look, mine is I feel sometimes pretty funny about telling this story because it just sounds kind of weird. But I decided to be a winemaker when I was about 14, sounds pretty strange. But the reason I did is that I come from a very large family and I'm the youngest of 12 children. And so I got to observe a lot. And I had older brothers who were at that stage bringing home wines to family functions mostly from the Hawke's Bay at that stage. And what I observed is that family functions were always so much better when there was a nice bottle of wine involved. We would just talk about the wine, people would debate about the wine, and rather than talking about politics or religion. And I thought, there's something in this wine. It's super interesting. It brings people together. Somehow it made everybody come together in a different way when you had an interesting bottle of wine that you could really discuss who made it, where did it come from, with the grape variety, and it really changed the dynamics, I think, of a family big lunch, which can, obviously, go off in all directions. So my interest was kind of pipped then as to what made wine so interesting. And I then worked for the caterer who had a really in-depth cellar, and I got the job of stock taking it of the cellar every month. And half the names, it was a lot of Bordeaux back then, and I couldn't pronounce the names, but it was incredibly interesting. I loved looking at the pictures of chateaus on the bottle, and I was still only about 15. I was really kind of mesmerized that everything I read about wine was so kind of interesting. There was depth and layers and culture. And in terms of, for me, I realized pretty early on that I wanted to make something tangible. I didn't want to be a lawyer or an accountant. That just wouldn't suit my personality. So when I left school at the age of 18, I decided that I wanted to go and work at a winery and really see if this whole gig of making wine was as interesting as I thought it would be. And this is quite early on in New Zealand's kind of winemaking path. And but Michael Cooper, a wine writer, had put out the Wine Atlas of New Zealand, and someone gave me a copy to flick through, and I flicked through that, and I chose about 8 wineries, and I really just chose them on the picture of what the people looked like. And Clive and Phil at Artarangi seemed really smiley and happy, and I was like, oh, I want to go work for them. I didn't really understand about what Pinot Noir was versus, Merlot, Bordeaux. I had some inkling that, Burgundy made a different variety than Bordeaux, but it was a very kind of loose kind of knowledge. So I wrote 8 letters, and Phil from Atarangi, she was the only person who replied, and she rang and said, could you come over and meet us? And my mother, who's a very resourceful person, said, sure. And we drove from the Kapiti Coast, which is on the west coast of New Zealand, not actually that far from Martin, but on the other coast. And we drove through over the Rimataka Ranges, and I was like, we are entering somewhere else. This is such a different region. I've never been to the Wairarapa before. And then I drove into Martinborough, and there was all these grapevines, and it was such a different experience for me. And we arrived in Artarangi, and Phyllis had just had her first baby, and babies for me were pretty normal from a big family, so I was handed the baby. And obviously, probably that's what got me the job, because I knew what to do with a baby. And so I spent that first year really doing everything. I worked in the vineyard, I did the cellar door, I looked after the kid, I looked after the baby, I put labels on bottles, I tissued, and everything. I just loved the dynamics of it, that every day was different. You never knew what was going to happen. The weather changed, the decisions needed to change. And it was really exciting talking through why we made all those changes. So after that 1 year here in Martinborough at Artarangi, when I was about the tender age of 19, I was like, right, this is really what I want to do. And I went off and studied for 4 years. I did a kind of engineering biochemistry degree. And at the end of that, I knew I wanted to make wine, but I also knew I needed to make some money. So I went and worked for a corporate food producer for about 3 years. And that really was important and galvanizing, that I definitely did want to make wine. I wanted to be farming, producing the fruit, making the product, knowing exactly everything, how it was made, and putting that into the bottle. So after that little wee stint, I started working. I worked in Central Otago with Duncan Forsyth, who's now Mount Edward. I worked with him at at Chard Farm. Had a great experience. I worked at Cloudy Bay with the old boys there back very, very early on. And then I went overseas, and I worked in Oregon and California, and came back, and then worked with Claire Mulholland at Martinborough Vineyard for 3 years. And during that time there was when I really, really cemented my love of Martinborough as a region. I could see that the Pinots from here had a special depth and quality and length of palate that I really, really enjoyed. What I forgot to say back about the trip, my first year in Martinborough, is that my mother, who is quite, being the mother of 12 children, when Phil handed me the baby and said, can you start work? I said, sure, I can. And she said, well, can you stay? And my mother said immediately, of course she can. And I said, but I don't have any clothes. My mother said, don't worry, I'll pack you up some, which made me a little nervous, because my mother's and I's clothes sense weren't very similar at the age of 18. But she did it. She went home, she packed up all my clothes into some bags, and she put them on a bus, and they arrived in 2 days. And it still blows me away to this day that somehow a bus service delivered my clothes to Martinborough quicker than a courier can these days. So heads off to my mother. She facilitated my getting out and doing things, and that kind of can-do attitude, which is still with me today. I ended up back here at Atarangi in 2003. I was working at Martinborough Vineyard, and the guys at Atarangi, who had become quite close family friends by now, said, do you want to come back here and work? And as by chance, I arrived thinking I was going to be assistant winemaker and was kind of tossed into this role as winemaker. So I really didn't have a lot of time to think about, the stresses of taking on a iconic New Zealand label. It was just like into it full force. And then I threw in having two children, two young children at the same time, which looking back on, I'm not sure how I did, but I do have a fabulously wonderful husband who's very patient and who worked from home. So really did bring up the children while I worked harvest, and really just threw my whole self into trying to really get to know what the fruit here was about, what it meant to make Artarangi Pinot Noir, not just Martinborough Pinot Noir. That was actually probably really interesting those first few years. My first kind of full vintage here was 2004. And that year, I think I just cried because, in February we had like 350 millimeters of rain. And I was just like, oh my Lord, we hadn't seen that before. And the whole place was flooded. But 2 days later, that water had drained away. And with careful picking, I look back on that wine and I couldn't drink it for about 10 years because I was so stressed out about the vintage. But now I just really love this is just a sort of silky quality about that wine. And then the next year's the next following years all had different trials, frosted, windy, something came along, a cyclone. And you just sort of learned to just brace yourself here in Martinborough against whatever was going to be thrown at you, and probably coming into it and really just having to just do it was probably the best thing that could have happened to me. And it meant that, facing the last 2 years, which have been difficult, 22 and 23, I probably had been more relaxed about it, had more resilience towards those vintages that have been really trying than I would have had I had those vintages first up and knew more. I think sometimes not knowing a lot helps you really overcome adversity. So this Artarangi is a very, very special place. It's a place that is completely family. Everything we do revolves around people rather than financial decisions, and which is what I really love. And you really get the sense of every decision is long term. It's not about making a decision that's about, well, how much profit is that going to bring? We have no idea half the time, but it feels right. And I really appreciate being able to work in a place where gut instinct and that ability to kind of weather the storm has been really the focus of just driving for quality, but also driving for a sense of who we are. Our wines are distinctly Artarangi and distinctly Martinborough, and we've been allowed to kind of, as a team, really explore what that means. And it is, we are quite distinctly different from other regions, Martinborough, and then Artarangi itself within Martinborough is quite distinctly different. And I think that's what's exciting. That's what drew me to the industry, back, gosh, that was like 1990.
Yeah, and I remember the first time you told me that story in person when I was over there a few months ago. You told me something about them wanting, thinking you were the babysitter, basically going, "Oh, great, we've hired a babysitter."
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I was handed the baby first up, and really, as I said, I've got the job because I kind of knew what to do with the baby. And that was fine because it allowed me time to really become part of the business, become part of what made Artarangi tick. If you're just doing a job, you start at 8 a.m. and you leave at 4, you get to see a part of it. But I became like the part of the family because, I was happy to do whatever you needed to do. And I think that's a really important quality, that if you really want to understand a business, just do whatever it takes. Sweep the floor, because you learn so much about what drives people, what makes things happen, not just the specific a set of tasks that need to happen. It's like you understand the culture by sweeping the floor and holding the baby. And yeah, it was incredibly important to be that versatile in terms of getting the role right at the beginning.
Yeah, I think that's a really good advice for anybody starting out. And I think often we forget with winemaking how hands-on it can be, and especially with maybe a small to medium-sized company where, you can just get stuck in so many different facets of the business. And just also to say that I can attest, I've only been there once, but even just that one time spending time with you and Clive, how tight knit you guys are. And it was such a feel good winery visiting, because you can see how much it is, as you say, about people and not profit. And you really see that playing out. And it was one of those visits that really kind of restores my faith in humanity and in the wine industry. And so it's just, it definitely shows. You can see it even from a brief visit with you. So what you've built there has been something really special, and that I think you should be really proud of. And I know you're on your 20th anniversary, right? So it's
Yeah,
just a time to
yeah.
reflect a bit.
No, it is great, and to me, I guess the more I've been in the business, it's not about that one amazing wine. It's about every wine really just being the best it can be for that year, and everybody in the team really getting that. 23 was a pretty trying vintage, but we went out there into the vineyard and we picked some Pinot Gris that, God, it just looked awful. And the guys in the vineyard, when we showed them this wine, they were so proud of what we'd been able to do together to really pull together a wine that is actually really beautiful. And I think just being able to really bring everybody in is the bit that really excites me now. It's not about making an icon wine. It's really about, have we as a team really tried to understand the weather, nail it, and do the best we can. I see that with when mentoring younger people coming in. It's like, don't be in a hurry. Don't be in a hurry to want your own brand, because it is such a bigger thing than you will ever understand if you want to do it well. And you need so many people around you to do it really well. It cannot be really tricky to do it as a one man band, especially if you want to grow the fruit. And I know for me, my husband and I purchased a vineyard in 15, which we'd been sourcing fruit for Atarangi from, and we live out there and we farm this vineyard. And he's a designer. He's not a viticulturalist at all, but he's actually becoming a really great viticulturalist because his attention to detail is amazing. So we live there, and my kids actually are pretty helpful. We farm that ourselves. So I come home from work here and am immersed in my own little kind of world of our vineyard. And what's been really great is to release that as a single vineyard under Atarangi, because it is part of what we do here at Atarangi, and showing individual sites that are quite different. And we do that really only when that site has a voice and has vine age and really distinctly shows a different aspect of the Martinborough Terrace.
Yeah, it really does too. You can see in your masters, in your Pinot, I should say, from your vineyard, you can really see that it definitely has the Atarangi style, but it's its own personality.
Yeah, yeah. And we have another vineyard which we released for the first time in 2020 called Cooltinga, which is completely different again. It's our only vineyard that is just all Dijon. Here at Atarangi, we always have a portion of the Able clone, which is very much part of our DNA here. But Cotinga wasn't planted by us, so it's all Dijon. And really, the exciting bit has been getting to know this very, very gravelly site right on the edge of the alluvial terrace, and figure out what makes this parcel sing. And for me, it was really seeing that this is such a red fruited, crunchy, bright wine. And so this wine, this is not aged in barrique. This is aged in large format foedera, so a 2,280 litre barrel, to really kind of lift and keep that wine quite fresh and bright. And these are just the tiny decisions that we make, but that we sit and dwell on and discuss. And that's the bit I love about, having such a great group of winemakers here in Martinborough. We can sit around and talk about little things like barrels versus foedera for hours, and what that brings to a wine. And those are discussions that kind of make the fine detail difference, but also such fun and such collegial things. And everyone has a different opinion, and that's okay. So it's kind of back to when I first experienced wine at 14 around the large family gatherings, is that somehow the discussion about wine seemed to be a lot more positive than discussions about a lot of things that can be out there in the world when there's a group of people together.
Can't discuss politics, but you can discuss wine, right?
Yeah, exactly. Especially when there's like uncles and aunts there who are with different views. Like, we were always terrified of children if politics was brought up. we'd all scatter.
Yeah, some things haven't changed, but I'm still impressed that at 14 it really piqued your interest, wine, because I feel like for me, and probably for a lot of other young teenagers, I would just glaze over. So the fact that you were interested that early, it was obviously meant to be. It was your calling.
It was so funny because I definitely didn't want my children to be that interested in wine at 14. So aren't we funny how hypocritical we can be?
Oh yes, that's like I wanted to be an actress desperately and pursued the theater for a long time in my first career, and then now I have kids. I'm like, please don't go into the theater. Don't be interested in the theater. Very hypocritical indeed.
I know. I think it's a common theme for parents.
It's true. Well, Helen, I think this is a good place to wrap up. I so appreciate you sharing your early day stories and updating us a little bit on what's happening there now. You really are such a fantastic face for both Ottaurangi, for Martinborough, and for New Zealand wine as a whole. So it's such a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you for your time. And hope the weather isn't too cold there.
Thank you. So there you have it. To become a winemaker, you've got to get your hands dirty, embarrass yourself a little, maybe shatter a few glass ceilings, and learn humility, humor, and connection to community all the way through. And if you have a wine question or someone you'd like us to interview, email us at podcast@wineenthusiast.net. We love hearing from you and appreciate your support. Please rate and review us wherever you listen to your podcasts. And remember to visit us at wineenthusiast.com for content and products that bring your love of wine to life.